or think is the Ukrainian counteroffensive will try and cut the land bridge, which keeps occupied. It keeps the Russians in the southern occupied stretch. They connect it with Crimea. Once the Ukrainians take that back, Crimea is very difficult to hold.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we're joined by the investigative journalist and war reporter, John Sweeney. John is a multi-award-winning journalist, broadcaster and writer. He's reported from 10, maybe more, war zones in the last 35 years. And his latest work has been investigating war crimes in Ukraine. And he joins us now from Kyiv. John, great to speak to you today. Thank you so much for your time. You're in Kyiv for the premiere of your documentary, The Eastern Front, Terror and Torture in Ukraine. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. But first, what is the situation like in Kyiv at the moment?
Well, it's very surreal because for the last month, the Russians have been sending their elderly ironmongery at us. There was one night in particular when they sent 6 hypersonic missiles and 12 cruise missiles. And then Ukrainian air defense, which makes a big racket when it does this, it knocks them out of the sky with these Patriot missiles. The Americans have given them, and they've got other stuff that's shooting down the Iranian Shaheeds. And this makes a terrible racket. But to be honest with you, Kate, I've actually been working on another book called Putin's Prisoner with this guy, Aidan Aslin, who was a British chap who was fighting with the Ukrainian Marines, captured by the Russians, tortured, stabbed, sentenced to death, and eventually traded in a prisoner exchange. And I finished this book that very night, and I went out and got very drunk, and I slept through the whole thing. to the astonishment of everybody. What? You slept through that? I said, I'm afraid I slept through that. So,
well, thank you so much for your honesty.
So what happens is that every night you go to bed, you don't know whether you're going to wake up in the morning. But actually, and a couple of times, they send so many missiles that the Ukrainian air defense fails. And a couple of times, some days ago, 2 young women in their early 30s and a 9-year-old girl were killed. So that can happen. At the same time, the cafes are open, the bars are open, the restaurants are open. And it feels like what I read about. I'm not that old, though I am 110. But it feels like what it's like being in London in 1940, in that all everybody wants to do is to drink beer and go dancing and listen to jazz. But they've got to fight the monster, Adolf Hitler, in our case, or rather in Britain's case. And now all everybody wants to do is go dancing and drink beer and listen to hip hop or whatever young people listen to these days. But at the same time, we these days, as far as I feel it, we have to fight this monster, Vladimir Putin. And so there is this tremendous electricity. Every moment of every day, you don't know whether it's your last. And I've got friends who are fighting right now in the Bakhmut front. My great Ukrainian friend, Vladimchenko, he arrested me on day 2 of the war because he thought I was a Russian spy. Do I look like a Russian spy? And anyway, we had quite a big argument, but he had a machine gun and I didn't. So he won the argument. Since then, we've become great friends. And so I know people who right now are fighting for a free Ukraine. And it feels, I think about them all the time. I think about the stories, you come across, which are so saddening. And then you think, this is, people here are fighting for their freedom. Things that we've kind of forgotten about in the comfortable West. And I think it's exhilarating to be here.
John, you're in Kyiv because you've just had the premiere for your new documentary, The Eastern Front. John, your mission was to get to the truth, to uncover the evidence of war crimes. What did you find and how widespread was it?
So the first thing is there are some useful idiots. Actually, there are rather too many useful idiots in the West, but some of them are very powerful. Let's take two, for example. One is Donald Trump, who is almost certainly going to become the Republican contender for the White House. So he has the potential to become the next president of the United States. And the other is Tucker Carlson, formerly of Fox TV, now on Twitter. And both of these men buy the Russian lie. And you can break down the Russian lie into a number of things. One of the things they say is they do not target civilians. So the Eastern Front, our film starts in Dnipro, where last January, the Russians put a massive missile, a rocket, into a working class block of flats in Dnipro, and they kill 55 people, including 6 kids. We go there and we just hang out and we talk to 2 mums and their kids. And of course, their children knew some of the kids who were killed because it's the same block. And one of the mums had a video of her filming her kids, and then suddenly everything goes orange and there's a terrible noise. This is the moment the rocket hits the block of flats, but she's in a neighboring block of flats. They're okay, but nevertheless, she captured it on film. So the idea that the Russians don't target civilians is a lie. And then throughout the film, we go everywhere. We don't talk to any generals, any politicians, any oligarchs. There are no sit-down interviews. It's very immersive. The director, Kaylin Robertson, is just shooting from there. And you can tell he's shooting because he's never been to a war zone before. So every time there's outgoing artillery, he jumps a mile. And again in the film, you see that Russia is targeting civilians. The second thing we set out to do is that Russia says it doesn't use banned weapons against civilians. It does. It uses incendiary bombs, white phosphorus, and this is against the Geneva Convention.
And you've seen this, have you, John? And you know
Yes.
for a fact that this came from the Russian forces.
What we've seen is video evidence of this white stuff descending from the sky. And then we followed the video. We found a guy who shot the video. This is in Kherson. And then we went to homes which had been completely burnt down. I mean, kind of incinerated because of this stuff. And then local Ukrainians, not soldiers, gave me the cartridges in which this stuff, they call lustrum, our kind of name for it is white phosphorus. When it comes down, this is the mechanism in which it comes down. So we set that out. The third thing is torture. The Russians say they don't use torture. And there are multiple people I've interviewed over the course of the years. I first came across Russian victims of torture in Chechnya 23 years ago. One of the things they do is they put on a gas mask. Your hands are tied behind your back, and they put a gas mask on, and then all they have to do is to throttle the nozzle of the gas mask, and you can't breathe. And that's what they do. They were doing it 23 years ago in Chechnya. They're doing it as we speak in Ukraine right now. So it's evidence that the Russians, when they say they don't target civilians, when they don't use banned weapons against civilians, when they say they don't torture, they are lying. And we're setting out that evidence in a way that's immediate, and you see it and you believe it. So we interview a torture victim, and he's back in the torture center, which is a former police station. And he starts breaking down on camera. Horrible as it is for this guy, he's called Alexander. He's a big man and a strong man and a confident man. Horrible as it is for him, he wants people to understand what happened. And it's anyway, that is what we've done in the film. Now, there are many other films like this, but it just feels you've got to tell this story where there are people like Trump and Tucker Carlson going around saying it's not happening, it's not true.
And you have submitted this evidence to the International Criminal Court. How confident are you that one day there will be a Nuremberg-style trial after this is all over?
I'm an optimist, Kate. So if I'm a cynic, I would say I'm not confident, but I'm not a cynic. I'm an optimist. And I'm 65, and I would like to predict that there will be war crimes in The Hague and there'll be big Russians. I don't think Putin will end up there because I think he'll fall out of a Kremlin window long before that, or he'll drink the wrong kind of tea or something like that. I think somebody will kill Putin before The Hague. However, I think Russians will stand in front of The Hague in my lifetime. And I'm going to try and stay alive long enough for that to be true.
As someone, John, who is passionate about uncovering the truth, you are in no doubt about the cause of the explosion at the Novokakhovka Dam. Can you explain your certainty?
Well, my name is John Sweeney, but you can call me Mystic Meg because I wrote this book, Killer in the Kremlin. And in the paperback edition, which I wrote in October, but it was published in February, I say the following. I don't think Putin's going to use a tactical nuke because, number one, Russia is next door to Ukraine. If he irradiates Ukraine, he's going to irradiate a lot of Russia too. Number two is the Chinese in particular really don't want him to because it will trigger a world recession and that will really hurt the Chinese economy and they're worried about it. And so I don't think that's going to happen. But I do think, I write in the book, they're going to hit the dam. And the reason why I say they're going to hit the dam is because although it's a terrible thing to do, it is not a nuclear escalation, which will cause Putin an enormous amount of trouble. It's something that can really, really hurt Ukraine. But nevertheless, it is below the nuclear escalation mark. And so I predicted it'll cause an enormous loss of life. It will cause enormous suffering to Ukraine. I hope I'm wrong. That's right.
And you cite reasons why you're absolutely certain that the Russians are behind this. What are those reasons?
This isn't in the book. I've written a piece for the New European, which I set it out. But essentially, there's one bank. Now, the Russian story is that the Ukrainian artillery from a distance hit the dam. But there's only one bank. And that means that for artillery, you've got a range artillery. To hit a big concrete structure, you really have to clobber it. And the Ukrainians did do this with another bridge they wanted to hit to stop the Russians getting across it. And it took a long, long time for them to do this. But this dam goes in one bang because the witnesses say there was one explosion and then suddenly we heard the sound of water roaring. One explosion means it's not artillery, it's not the Ukrainians, it's a mine placed at the bottom on the dry side of the dam. Bang, you do that, and then the whole dam goes. Now, what's happened is, militarily, the Ukrainian army, which is right now about to start its summer counteroffensive, has not its eyes off the ball because it has to go and rescue tens of thousands of Ukrainians who are now struggling with floods. And while that's happening, that rescue operation is taking place, the Russians are shelling them. Now that means the rescuers have got to be many of the rescuers have got to be military. So therefore, this is entirely inside the Russian playbook. They are being pitiless, but they're not escalating to a nuclear level. It's the reason why I predicted it would happen. And I'd like to say, because I've been I saw war crimes committed by Vladimir Putin and his army in Chechnya 23 years ago. And therefore, the level of cruelty was so dire, so dark then, that this kind of thing is absolutely what the Russians do. And the Ukrainians don't do, because they care very much. Because they're a democracy, they care about their people, they care about human life, and they care about the rules of war. So not the Ukrainians, the Russians, primarily because there's only one bang, but this absolutely fits the Russian playbook.
And assuming the US signals intelligence confirms this, that the Russians were behind this attack, what does it tell us about the future direction of the war and Russia's intentions for Crimea?
Well, good question. By the way, the Americans still haven't, because I said in the New European article that the Americans are going to come up with something to prove it. But what's happened since is a Norwegian seismologist has come up with a report saying it's one explosion, and then that points to the Russians. So seismology says one explosion, which means it's the Russians. But the consequence is you destroy the water supply for Kherson and Mykolaiv, two big cities in the south on the Ukrainian side, on the Ukraine territory, but also it supplies water to Crimea. Now, Crimea is currently under Russian occupation, but it's water barren, okay? So it's got to me, this signals that the Russians have given up on holding Crimea. It's a strategic surrender. But kind of like, I'm afraid to say this, but I think it's true. What we're looking at is almost a version of an abusive relationship, where a man, a partner, has lost the woman, and he cannot have the woman, and the woman has said, no, go away. And so what he's doing is scarring the woman with acid or something like this to say, I can't have you, but I will try and ruin you. And it's that level of pitiless cruelty which is a hallmark of Vladimir Putin's psychopathy.
And if Russia has given up on Crimea, as you say, where will they be focusing on?
But no, I think it's not quite the same. It's like what they've done is they've blown up the reservoir which supplies water to Crimea. They're not leaving Crimea tomorrow, and they will fight for it. But down the track, you don't blow up the water reservoir for a water-barren place if you really, really think you're going to stay there forever. So I think what they're going to do is that they're going to try and do their level best to stay, but they're in trouble because what we all think is the Ukrainian counteroffensive will try and cut the land bridge, which keeps occupied. It keeps the Russians in the southern occupied stretch. They connect it with Crimea. Once the Ukrainians take that back, Crimea is very difficult to hold. For British listeners, you should think of the Isle of Wight. Actually, because it's almost like the Isle of Wight, although it's much, much, much bigger, but physically it looks like that. And so imagine trying to hold on to the Isle of Wight. If you're an occupying army, it's going to be really difficult because effectively you can only reinforce by sea. And now the Ukrainians have got enough missiles that can sink Russian ships. We all know that because they've sunk at least the Russians' big battleship. So I think they're in trouble, and I think the Ukrainian counteroffensive will work. The question is not when the war stops, it's how long will it take for the Ukrainians to kick the Russians out of all of Ukraine? And the other question is how many more people will die while Putin carries on with his special military operation?
How difficult is it for the wider public to get the truth now compared to when you started your career, with the strength of disinformation, the speed of information sharing, and the growing options for deep fake?
It's worrying. It worries. One of the reasons why we made the film is to deal with this dark nonsense, but it's worrying. I can remember when I was on the Sheffield Telegraph in the 80s, and one day some nasty person put I was a good reporter. I was getting a name for myself, and I had a little wooden pigeonhole, and they put a note in saying it's all the fault of the Jews. And this was nonsense. I picked it up and put it in the bin. Now you do that, and you can have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of followers on Twitter, Facebook, across the digital media. In the old days, you could read the Daily Star, World War II bomber found on moon, or the Financial Times, but you knew the difference. You would look at the source of information. Is it the FT or the Times, reliable more or less, or is it a rubbishy newspaper? Now on the internet, you cannot tell the difference. And so what's happened is that people like Trump, and I would say in Britain, Nigel Farage, have kind of weaponized people's ignorance, lack of intellectual rigor, lack of intellectual curiosity, and they've weaponized it and in the way that Hitler did. This is old stuff. Populism has got its tropes, but nevertheless, big tech, new tech, has kind of made this weaponization of insecurity and fear and failure, has made it much, much more easy to do. And at the same time, it's the great line from W.B. Yeats, the worst are full of a passionate intensity, while the best lack all conviction. And so it's far harder to get people to understand what's happening. Now, this drives me. So since the big war started, I've now written 2 books and I've made a 60-minute film. So I'm kind of absolutely driven. You can almost say driven nuts. Thank you very much. I said it. Yeah. First, okay, but you gave me a look, but at the same time, this is a battle. It's a battle for the lives of ordinary Ukrainians, men, women, and children. And I've seen with my eyes the Kyiv TV tower attack last March. I saw the people from the morgue take away a mother and her 5-year-old child. And one of my Ukrainian friends, her kids went to school with that kid who's dead. So men, women, and children are dying here in Ukraine because of Putin's dark nonsense. But in the wider sense, all of us in the Western world are in trouble and under threat while Vladimir Putin remains in the Kremlin. And worst of all, at least some of us are saying, well, no, he's the good guy. Or rather, or else they're saying things like, well, the Ukrainians should just kind of do a deal with him. You want to do a deal with a man whose army rapes and castrates and tortures? Can you want to do a deal with that kind of guy? I don't get it. And that's what drives me.
You mentioned earlier your friend who's fighting in Bakhmut. What's he telling you about? Are you in contact with him now? Is he giving you an update on how it is going there and what the state of play is?
No, we have kind of slightly more surreal. He wouldn't. That's kind of operational security. But he's a good bloke, and Vova, and he just sent me birthday greetings from Bakhmut. So and he's in Ukrainian Special Forces. Listen, he's not doing flower arranging in Bakhmut. He's fighting. He's trying to get rid of the Russian invaders. But the spirit. I mean, I'll tell you a story. I've been to Bakhmut 7 times, but only last year because it got far too heavy this year, and I decided, you're an old fool, Sweeney, but don't go to Bakhmut this year. But I went last year. On one of the occasions, I went with Vova and our American pal, Chris Occhioni, who's a great photographer. And we're in the Ukrainian trenches. I mean, unbelievable, there are trenches. But I'm sitting in the Ukrainian trench, drinking a cup of tea, and on the cup it says in Ukrainian, "Best Grandma." And Chris is a funny New Yorker. He says, "Hey, John." No, so Vova says, by the way, it says "Best Grandma." And Chris says, "Hey, John, you can be a grandma if you want to be. That's why Ukraine is fighting this war. and we're giggling, and the Russian army is a kilometer away. So now that's the Ukrainian. That's what it's like hanging out with the Ukrainian army. We're sitting in a trench, drinking tea, giggling at silly jokes, and that's what it's like. By the way, have you seen my nails?
Yeah, I have. They're beautiful. Who did those for you?
So for people who is this audio or visual? I can't remember.
Visual. We can see them very nicely. Thank you.
Yeah. So anyway, I got them done for the premiere and as a joke, but also what happened yesterday was I went into my normal cafe and had soup for lunch, and I said, "Well, how much is it?" And they said, "No, you're not paying for lunch because of your nails." So like, my manicure has almost paid for itself already. Which, by the way, it's quite painful. When the lady attacked, I felt really. I mean, women are so much tougher than
John,
men.
of all the things I thought we'd be talking about today, I didn't think we'd be talking about manicures.
Let's have a look at yours. Let's have a look at yours.
They're
I love it.
Clearly, I'm in the wrong place. Yeah. You remain, John, an optimist about the future, that Ukraine will regain all of the territory that it has lost. Why do you think that will happen?
Because of the spirit of the Ukrainian soldiers, because of the spirit of the Ukrainian people. Last October the 10th, they sent 4 cruise missiles, hit Kyiv just before Kyiv had proper air defense, and they killed 18 people, including a doctor, a woman doctor who looks after kids sick with cancer, leaving her daughter an orphan. And we talked to this old lady, and her flat had completely been smashed up because of the blast wave from the rocket. The rocket hit the other building, but everybody in the block of flats, all their windows are smashed up. And I say to this old lady, "Do you think you should do a deal with the Russians?" And she's obviously, she would have, she was 70 or something like this, but she would have been a beauty in her prime, and still had something about it. And she just turned at me and said, "Are you kidding? That's Ukraine. Ukraine is going to." It reminds me of what I read, what my mum and dad told me about being in the Second World War, fighting the Nazis. My dad was a ship's engineer in the Battle of Atlantic. My mum was a schoolgirl, and in Liverpool. And one time in Yugoslavia, I phoned her up and I said, "Oh God, the hotel I'm in, the windows have just been blown out by a bomb or shelling." And she goes, "Oh, that happened to us 8 times during the war." No, but that spirit, that's what it feels like to be here. And you're never too far away from a joke, from some sense of humor, of a punchline.
What do you think the consequences will be, or the impacts will be, if this war is still ongoing when the next US president is chosen, when you've got people like Donald Trump saying they can end the war in 24 hours with whatever that means?
I think the Ukrainians are aware they have a deadline, and the deadline is November the 4th. They kind of need to win the war before the next American election, in particular, if Trump is looking strong. So, but I'm optimistic in that I think that the Ukrainians, because there are 3 critical things for a war: to win a war, to lose a war. The first is spirits, the second is logistics, the third is leadership. The Russians have got bad spirit because, they're fighting the war to defeat the Nazis. Zelensky's Jewish. I don't write for them very often, but I am the stringer for the Jewish Chronicle here in Kyiv. By the way, they phoned me up last March, and I said, "But I'm not Jewish." And he said, "Yeah, we know." And then there was a pause. "There's no one else." So So I am, if Ukraine is Nazi, then I am the reporter for the Jewish Chronicle in this Nazi-controlled capital, and I am free to go about my lawful business here. It's just dark nonsense. The Russians have, their spirit is weak. Ukrainian spirit is strong because they're defending their homes. The logistics, the Russian logistics was much better than the Ukrainian logistics, but Western aid has changed that. I'm excited. The big counteroffensive, we'll see evidence of it when we see British Challenger tanks popping up in Russian videos. And you can tell the British Challenger tanks because they drive on the wrong side of the road. Boom, boom. He's on all night missions. And
You're
then
never
the
far
third
from a
thing,
joke, are you?
yeah, well, because I might die at any moment, and therefore it's unlikely. I'm most likely die because coming back from the pub here, I often use e-scooters. This is the most anyway, but never mind that. But also, there's a possibility of rockets and all that kind of stuff. So joking is good for the soul. The third thing is so the logistics. Now Ukraine's got the advantage, and then there's leaders. Putin sees the world with Brezhnev secret policeman glasses. He doesn't understand the 21st century. Zelensky is a comedian turned politician. He's a wonderful leader, and beneath him, his general Zaluzhny is an incredibly good general. So the Ukrainians, I think, will win this war either this year, and it's very possible they could win it this year, or they will win it next year before the American election.
What do they have to do
That's
to win
my,
it this year?
we have to do a lot in terms of we have to give them F-16s, and we should have given them this spring, and we're giving them this autumn. That's a mistake. The Americans need to give them ATACMS, which is rocket artillery. Now, we've given them some, but we don't have much. By the way, my view of America is that it's a great place, but when it comes to fighting wars, they're always a bit late. So First World War, 1917. Second World War, they think it started in 1941. No, it didn't. It started in 1939. However, once the Americans do bother to turn up, it's okay. And so what's happened is, for a long time, the Americans and the Germans were afraid of giving too much kit to the Ukrainians, lest they escalate, or lest there's some kind of escalation. Now, I look at that now and I think, what are they talking about? Escalation. I mean, look at what's happened with the Russians blowing up the dam, etc., etc., etc. However, having said all that, I think that Biden has got it, and actually, the Chinese, so Putin is now very dependent on China, and the Chinese don't want a nuclear weapon used, so he's not going to use a nuclear weapon, and then there's the problem with irradiating southern Russia too. So that's holding him in a kind of cage. And all we have to do is, the more we can help the Ukrainians, the faster this war is over, the fewer people will die.
And John, of all the wars you've reported from, how does this one compare?
So most of the wars I've covered were utterly dispiriting because you just saw a kind of senseless loss of life. So the wars in former Yugoslavia were about what? Former Yugoslavia had lots of problems, but it wasn't an evil place, or it may have been when Tito was savage in 45, 46, 47, 48. But by the time the 70s came along, Yugoslavia was actually one of the nicest places to live inside the kind of Soviet zone. And so the wars in Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia were evil and terrible. And about what? I never properly understood. This war I understand cleanly and clearly. This is a peaceful democracy. There are lots of problems with Ukraine. There's lots of problems with the United Kingdom. By the way, I did this joke in February, but you can get hold of tomatoes in Kyiv a lot easier than you can in London. And that's absolutely true. But there's something, there is something, this is a just war in the way that 39-45 was a just war. And I would find it hard. I'd have to say, for example, the war against Iraq, was that a just war? I'm not sure. This war is a just war because all we're doing is we're not fighting, we're helping our fellow Democrats, our people who also believe in democracy and common decency and the rule of law. We're helping them fight. And that's kind of beautiful. And that's why I'm here.
John Sweeney, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much for your time. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. Thank you for watching, and thanks to our producer. Bye-bye.